Okay, so let's talk about racial formation theories. So racial formation is the theory that says that race is socially and historically created through a process in which racial categories are created. These are achieved through what we call political projects. I'll show you that in a minute. I've added a couple slides with pictures. Over time, the society's powerful institutions define what race is and who's to be classified within each racial category. And we continuously shape, reinterpret, and define racial categories. So we saw the OMB and we saw the academic definitions of race, but what we didn't see is how race is a social construction. So the way we perceive race, even though there's an interpretation that it's biological, and sometimes it's interpreted as race is interpreted as a fact. Race is in fact a social construction, or what we call a social fact, because it's not a biological fact. It's historical policies, ideologies, we call them in sociology, political projects, political implications are very significant in how we define race. For example, in the 1930s and 40s, Jewish people were constructed as an inferior race. However, today, Jewish people are not constructed as an inferior race. And even in the 1930s and 40s, this idea of Jewish people being inferior was supported by science and political projects, what we now call scientific racism and political projects. What happens at the same time when you see a particular racial group being subordinated or further pushed down, they're going to go often from an ethnic group to a racial group, or we can also move from a racial group to an ethnic group. So with the identity of being Jewish, we see Jewish people move from a religious ethnic group into a racial category. After this was done through a series of political projects, that's when we saw millions of Jewish people being murdered. So it's part of the process of subjugating a particular group or a racial category. So what are racial projects? Basically, they're an interpretation or a representation of racial dynamics. And it helps us to recognize and redistribute resources or ideas. So I'm showing you a couple pretty antiquated ones so that you can see, if you look at these historical ones, you can see how race is constructed as, or how these racial groups were constructed in this time. It's because we have distance from it, it becomes more obvious to us. So let's start with this one. And we've seen during the Industrial Revolution, here it says, just bluntly, the Chinese must go. So many Chinese men were brought into the United States in order to build the railroads as cheap, ready labor. Chinese, Irish, Italians were all brought in to build the railroads, many of which were killed afterwards instead of paid. So you can see this, idea after their labor, them as a group or community were no longer needed economically. They were trying to push this group out. So you would have a lot of negative racial stereotyping towards this group. Here we see an example of a racial group that's being dehumanized. And you see this often when you're trying to subjugate a racial group, you'll dehumanize a group. So this woman, Irish, was being depicted here as, more of an animal. And this is fairly common. So they're showing two representations of the same woman. And this is, a representation of Irish women. This other one here, this is an example of, you have here a white male protecting American children. You can see the building in the background is representative of our, Washington monuments, buildings, that type of thing. These that look like alligators are not. If you look closely, what you see is a hat that's open. There's the face, here's the robe, and here's the cross. So if you haven't got it quite yet, this would be Catholic popes, priests. You would see this man is protecting these children from the onslaught of Catholicism. If you thought this was only in the past, I'd like to give you an example of how we do it today. And this is a nice colorblind, racialized project. So part of colorblind racism is that we don't actually use the words race or talk about the racial group we're signifying. But we have here the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddling masses, yearning to, and she says wholly explicative, right? So here we have 3 million illegal aliens per year. Now we know that illegal aliens come from a variety of countries, but when we talk about illegal aliens, we have one ethnic group in mind. And so here, the new racial project is towards Hispanics, and it has been for several years since the economic downturn in 2006 is when it ramped up to its kind of highest volume. It's dissipating again now that we're at the lowest levels of unemployment in very long time. But this is a way in which we do colorblind racism, and it's the new current political project. As we have economic issues, we always turn to racialized projects to blame one group or another, so that we're continuously looking at each other as opposed to looking up at the elite classes. So the reason why I'm giving you all of these definitions and these understandings is because we're moving to a more complex theory, and this is the theory of intersectionality. You have to take into account social stratification, social structure, what we call additive models and difference models. Social stratifications are hierarchical arrangements, different access to resources and power. So you still may see this taught in school, but this was the leading theory in my time when I was taking classes. And essentially what you're doing is you're putting the different groups into a hierarchical arrangement, how we would perceive them in our society today. The problem with that is in doing so in academia, it acts as a way to reinforce that hierarchical social stratification. And so we're moving towards a different approach. But you also have to take into account what we call social structures. So social structures, ever-changing social framework, then impacts the behavior of the world. But we've talked about social structures before. These are the institutions. Yes, the institutions are changing. We don't see the Jim Crow racism, but we do see inequality of result based on race in the judicial system, in the healthcare system, in the educational system, within a whole variety of institutions in our society. So if you take that into account and you add to it what we call the additive model. So we talked about earlier how you might see yourself in some instances as the dominant group, while in other instances you might be part of the subordinate group. If you add all of those social groups together based on their different status from the norm, you get the additive model. So you can start to see lack of access to resources, accumulated disadvantages and accumulated advantages through the additive model in a spectrum of access or a spectrum of domination and subordination, as opposed to just one or the other in a kind of binary sense, right? So moving away from those binary models, and it's the same thing that you were learning last week with sex, sexuality, gender, all of those things. We love to put things in binaries, but they don't work. They're not going to work for sex, and they're not going to work for race. So we've moved towards what we call a difference model. And this is a focus on the unique experiences of the group. So often when you see at your workplace, you'll see culture day at school or at workplace. It's focused in on this difference model, and it's all well and good, but you have to add more to the understanding other than we are all different, and that's okay. That's only part of the story, right? And understanding that all of the different cultures, racial groups, classes, ethnicities, all play a part in constructing the society and the social interaction within the society that we live in. This matrix of domination includes a history of social classifications. So it creates a unique and evolving experience. And we can treat people or groups separately, right? So we can look at them separately and how they intersect in individual lives and within groups. That brings us to the intersectional model. So intersectionality. This is the current and most comprehensive theory about race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability. It includes macro-level social structures, history, law, like history, law, and bureaucracy. But it also includes micro-level interaction perspective, like culture, socialization, norms, values, mores. But that's only part of it. Society is always in an evolving state with its own life beyond individuals. Human perspectives, although they influence ideologies, are also greatly influenced by ideologies. So as you can see at this point in the class, in the lecture, and in terms of your next assignment, this is a complex theory. We need to break apart into its components so that you can use it to analyze it. You're going to do something a little bit more complex than you've done throughout the entire semester. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of effort on your part. It's probably something you've not ever been asked to do. So we don't do this type of critique or analysis very often. But I'm going to walk you through it, and we're going to focus in on using this theory and its parts to complete assignment 11, which is to break intersectionality down into its components and analyze a video we're using from YouTube called Trina's Story. Next video will explain that.